Hello friends! Did you know that in the modern world, we check the time an average of 110 times a day? Now imagine, how did people live for centuries without these small mechanisms on their wrists or phone screens constantly telling them what time it is? Welcome to an amazing journey. Through the most unusual and ingenious ways, our ancestors determined time. If you're curious about how humanity oriented themselves in time before the invention of the familiar clocks, then quickly hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. This way, you won't miss other fascinating stories about how people solved everyday tasks in the past. And now, let's dive into the world of amazing time traditions, some of which might come in handy in modern life if your phone suddenly dies or your watch breaks. Time is one of the most mysterious concepts in our lives. It flows elusively, you cannot touch or see it, but we constantly feel it. And although today we measure it with accuracy down to fractions of a second, it wasn't always this way. Ancient people perceived time completely differently, not as a linear sequence of minutes and hours, but as a cyclical process connected to natural rhythms. For them, time was tied to the sunrise and sunset, to the phases of the moon, to the seasons of the year, and agricultural cycles. And this perception formed special, sometimes whimsical methods of measuring time, which we will explore today. Let's see how humanity learned to feel and measure this invisible substance without the help of modern technology. The first tradition worth telling about is determining time by celestial bodies. This method is perhaps the most ancient. Even cave dwellers noticed the cyclical movement of the sun and the onset of darkness. Archaeologists find evidence that 15,000 years ago, Ice Age people marked the phases of the moon by making notches on bone plates. But interestingly, different cultures developed remarkably accurate systems based on the position of stars. For example, Polynesian navigators could determine the time of night with accuracy up to half an hour, simply by observing the position of certain constellations relative to the horizon. They knew that the Pleiades constellation appears at a certain height at a specific time of year, and northern residents used the North Star and the Big Dipper as a giant hand of celestial clock. Imagine the situation. You're standing on the ocean shore. Not a soul around, just the sound of waves and the starry sky above your head. And by these very stars, you understand with incredible accuracy what time it is and in which direction you need to sail. Amazing? But it worked for centuries. The ancient Maya developed such an accurate astronomical calendar that they could predict solar eclipses hundreds of years in advance. They built special observatories where priests observed the movement of stars and planets. On certain days, sunlight penetrated through narrow openings in the walls of temples, illuminating only specific symbols on the walls, thus determining the exact time of year and the approach of important agricultural dates. And in ancient Egypt, there was a special instrument, the merkhet. It was a simple stick with a plumb line that allowed the observer to align with the North Star and track the movement of other stars to determine time at night. Egyptian astronomers compiled special tables indicating which stars rise above the horizon at certain times of the year and day. Such a device was so accurate that it allowed determining time with an error of just a few minutes. Of course, we cannot fail to mention sundials, one of the most widespread time-measuring instruments in human history. From the simplest sticks stuck in the ground to the most complex architectural structures, sundials evolved over millennia. In ancient China, there were gnomons, special tall poles, the shadow of which fell on a marked area. Interestingly, Chinese astronomers noticed that the length of the shadow at noon changes depending on the season and used this to determine not only the time of day, but also the time of year. And in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, archaeologists found portable sundials, small folding devices that wealthy Romans carried with them. It turns out that the idea of wearable gadgets existed 2,000 years ago. But what if the sky is overcast with clouds and you need to know the time? This is where the second amazing tradition came to help: water clocks or clepsydras. These devices were used in ancient Egypt, Babylon, Greece, China, and many other civilizations. The working principle was brilliantly simple. Water slowly flowed from one vessel into another through a small hole, and time markings were made on the vessel walls. But the most sophisticated designs appeared in China. There, court engineer Su Song created water clocks with wheels and figurines that moved, marking the hours. In fact, this was the first automated chronometer in the world. Interestingly, water clocks were even used in the courts of ancient Greece and Rome. Lawyers' speeches were limited by a certain amount of water in the clepsydra, hence the expression, "time has run out." If the speaker needed more time, he asked the judge to stop the water. And witnesses giving testimony were told, "Speak while the water flows." In some Egyptian temples, priests used special water clocks with a translucent alabaster body and illumination. At night, such clocks glowed from within, allowing time to be determined even in darkness. And do you know what problem the creators of water clocks solved in winter? The water froze. Therefore, in cold weather, they added salt or other substances that lowered the freezing temperature. Some advanced clepsydras even had a system to compensate for changes in water flow rate at different temperatures, an incredible engineering solution for its time. In Persia, inventors created clepsydras with floats and a system of pulleys that moved the hands on a dial. And the most complex water clock in the world was built in Damascus in the 13th century. It showed not only time, but also phases of the moon, and even included an automated mechanism counting 5 daily prayers for Muslims. The third method, no less ingenious, fire clocks. In China, Japan, and some parts of Europe, they used candles with markings. When the candle burned down to a certain mark, it meant that a specific period of time had passed. But the most unusual version of fire clocks was invented in medieval Korea. There they used special aromatic sticks that burned at a certain speed. Small metal balls on strings were attached to them. When the stick burned down to the string, the ball fell into a metal bowl, making a ringing sound. Imagine what it's like to determine time by smell and sound. In Buddhist temples in Japan, this method is still sometimes used during certain ceremonies. In China during the Song dynasty, they created fire clocks, similar to a small stove. They burned a special powder that smoldered at a constant speed. The powder lines were laid in zigzags to save space, and different sections were marked with special aromatic additives. Thus, one could not only see, but also smell what time it was, even waking up in the middle of the night. And the most luxurious fire clocks were made from special types of wood or exotic resins, which, when burning, emitted a pleasant aroma. Imagine an alarm clock that doesn't irritate with ringing, but wakes you with a gentle fragrance. Particularly poetic were fire clocks with incense laid out in the form of a labyrinth. The flames slowly moved through this labyrinth, and monks could determine the time by which part of the pattern the fire was in. In some Chinese homes, they used fire clocks with special inks that changed color when heated. This created a colorful pattern that changed over time. And in Tibet, for tracking long periods, for example, the duration of religious retreats, they used massive aromatic sticks that could burn for several weeks or even months. Monks knew that a certain part of such a stick burns down in exactly 1 day, and thus measured prolonged periods of time. In this way, time literally became smell, smoke, and light. The fourth tradition of determining time is the use of hourglasses. We've all seen these symmetrical glass constructions with sand inside, but few know that on medieval sailors' ships, hourglasses were the main instrument for measuring time. And it wasn't ordinary sand that was used, but crushed eggshells or marble dust, which didn't compact from humidity and moved at the same speed. Every 4 hours, a special sailor turned the hourglass and rang the bell, a special maritime way of announcing the time. Interestingly, keeping watch near the hourglass was one of the most responsible tasks on the ship. In some fleets, intentionally turning the hourglass at the wrong time could even be punishable by death. After all, the accuracy of time determination depended on determining longitude and consequently the ship's position in the ocean. And did you know that hourglasses were the only reliable way to measure time at sea until the 18th century? Mechanical clocks of that time were thrown off by the rolling and humidity, and precise navigation required high accuracy. But most interestingly, different tasks required different hourglasses. 3-minute ones were used for boiling eggs, hour-long ones for church sermons, and 4-hour ones for changing guard on the ship. Many ships even had a special cabinet where hourglasses of different durations were stored. And in some European universities, hourglasses were used to measure time during examinations. The professor had large hourglasses on his desk, and when the sand ran out, the student had to finish his answer, no matter how brilliantly he was performing. Another curious fact. In medieval hospitals, hourglasses were used to measure patients' pulses. The doctor counted pulse beats while the sand ran through a small hourglass. If too many or too few beats were counted, this indicated health problems. It can be said that hourglasses were the first medical instrument for cardiological research. Sailors trusted this method so much that navigators calculated the distance traveled using hourglasses to measure time. The fifth tradition, probably one of the most poetic, determining time by plants and animals. In different cultures, people noticed that some plants open and close their flowers at certain times of the day. The famous scientist Carl Linnaeus even created a flower clock, a flower bed where plants were planted in a circle according to the time their buds opened. From morning to evening, flowers bloomed one after another, as if passing the baton of time. Linnaeus studied this issue in such detail that he compiled a detailed schedule. Chicory opened at 4 in the morning, poppy at 5, sow thistle at 6, water lily at 7, marigold at 9 in the morning, and so on throughout the day. Some plants, on the contrary, closed at a certain time. For example, field bindweed folded its petals around 16 hours, and night jasmine opened only after sunset, announcing the arrival of evening. Interestingly, this method worked even in cloudy weather, plants oriented not only to light but also to internal biological rhythms. In rural Europe, farmers determined time by the behavior of domestic animals. They knew that cows usually lie down to rest at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and wake up for evening grazing around 16 hours. Shepherds in the Alps determined time by the behavior of goats and sheep, which at certain hours sought shelter from the sun, or conversely, went out to open areas. And in some Asian villages, people were awakened not by roosters, but by a certain type of night insect that fell silent just before dawn. Burmese monks learned to determine nighttime by the singing of different bird species and the activity cycles of monkeys. It turns out that different bird species begin to sing at strictly defined times before dawn. First ones, then others, creating a kind of awakening symphony by which an experienced ear could determine how much time remained until sunrise. In the Amazon, some indigenous tribes use even frogs for time orientation. Certain species croak only at specific hours after sunset. And in some parts of Africa, locals determine the approach of noon by the behavior of elephants, which seek shade and gather near water sources during the hottest time of day. Surprisingly, in India, there were even flower alarms. People who needed to wake up at a certain time were advised to drink a certain amount of water before sleep, depending on when they needed to get up. The accuracy of such a method was amazing. The body woke up exactly at the right time. Imagine how amazing it is to live in a world where time can be determined by the smell of flowers or the singing of birds. In some regions of India, you can still meet people who can tell what time it is just by listening to the sounds of the forest or looking at the behavior of local animals. Such a connection with nature seems almost magical for a modern city dweller. The sixth tradition, musical and sound methods of measuring time. In medieval cities of Europe and the Middle East, special drummers or trumpeters worked who, at certain hours, performed special melodies, notifying residents about the time. In some Muslim countries, the main chronometer was the muezzin's calls to prayer, which sounded 5 times a day from the minarets. In medieval Krakow, there was a special tradition. Every hour, a trumpeter played the Hedgnau melody from the tower of St. Mary's Church, and the melody broke off in the middle. According to legend, this happened in the 13th century when the trumpeter was killed by a Tatar arrow during an enemy invasion. This tradition is preserved to this day, and the Hedgnau melody has been sounding over Krakow every hour for more than 700 years. And in Venice, in St. Mark's Square, there are famous clocks with moving figures that strike the time. It's a whole mechanical spectacle that attracts tourists from all over the world. Interestingly, in China, there were musical water clocks in which falling water drops set in motion miniature hammers beating a melodious rhythm every hour. The Chinese believed that the flow of time should be not only accurate but also harmonious, hence the idea of combining time measurement with music. In the imperial palace of the Tang dynasty, there were even water clocks that not only showed time but also performed different melodies depending on the hour of the day. Morning hours were accompanied by vigorous, energetic motifs, and evening ones by more calm and relaxing ones. In some parts of Africa, talking drums are still used to communicate time to remote villages. Different rhythmic patterns mean different times of day, and people far from the settlement can determine the approximate time by the sound of these drums. And in some regions of Tibet, monks tracked time by the duration of reading certain mantras. They knew that reading a specific sacred formula required a strictly defined amount of time. For example, Om Mani Padme Hum repeated 108 times at a certain speed, took exactly 1 hour. Thus, the rhythm of prayer became the rhythm of time. In the Japanese tradition, there were special wooden clappers, the strikes of which marked the beginning and end of meditation periods. Zen monks could determine time intervals with high accuracy based only on their inner feeling. This was called time consciousness and was specially trained through years of spiritual practice. And in the ancient Indian tradition, for short periods of time, they used the concept of prana, the time needed for one breathing cycle. For example, some meditative exercises were prescribed to be performed for 100 pranas, and experienced yogis could measure this time without any external devices. Amazingly, time-determining instruments simultaneously set the rhythm and mood for the entire life of a city or community. And finally, the seventh, most mysterious tradition, determining time using unusual folk methods. For example, residents of some mountainous regions of Switzerland could determine time by measuring the length of their shadow. They used their own body as a kind of solar pointer. A person's steps also served as a measure of time. In some cultures, distances were measured not in kilometers, but in the time needed to cover them. The village is 2 hours' walk from here. Such a way of indicating distance was more practical in mountainous areas, where travel speed depended heavily on the terrain. And in some parts of Polynesia, people measured cooking time. They knew that if you put a certain root vegetable in hot earth near a thermal spring, it would cook in exactly such and such a period of time. Polynesians developed a whole system of culinary timers, different products cooked for different times, and by the degree of readiness of a certain dish, one could understand how much time had passed. For example, cooking taro in hot earth took about an hour, and sweet potato about 40 minutes. Thus, the process of cooking food became simultaneously a way of measuring time. In medieval Europe, there was a way to measure time by burning rope. The rope was specially impregnated to burn at a constant speed, and knots were tied on it at equal intervals. When the fire reached the next knot, it meant that a certain period of time had passed. Such rope clocks were especially popular with night watchmen who needed to mark time in the dark. And in some monasteries, they used oil lamps with special markings on the walls. By the level of oil, one could determine how much time had passed since the lamp was lit. But perhaps the most unusual method was used in some parts of India and Africa. There they measured time needed for milking a cow or cooking rice. They said, "Let's meet after 2 cow milkings," or "I'll return in the time it takes to cook 1 pot of rice." And what's most amazing, everyone perfectly understood what time period was being talked about. In some African tribes, time periods were measured by the number of pipes smoked. Wait for me, 2 pipes meant about half an hour, the time needed to leisurely smoke 2 pipes of tobacco. In some Amazonian tribes, there was a tradition of measuring time by the speed of drying certain leaves or by changes in their color. The leaf has not yet turned yellow could mean that less than half an hour had passed. Indigenous Australians developed a way of measuring time using sticks inserted into an anthill. They knew that ants of a certain species moved the stick a fixed distance in a certain time and used this to measure periods of several hours. And some nomadic peoples of Central Asia measured time by the speed of a camel caravan. The distance of 1 day's journey was a standard unit of measurement for both space and time. Such methods seem strange to us, but they were perfectly suited to the rhythm of life of those societies. Another little-known but amazingly accurate way of determining time was used by sailors in Micronesia. They placed a small coconut with a hole in a large container of water. Water gradually seeped into the nut through the hole, and when it gained a certain weight, it sank. This meant that a specific amount of time had passed. After that, the nut was removed, emptied, and the process began again. The accuracy of such a method was sufficient to determine the favorable time for fishing, associated with the tides. And in some regions of the Himalayas, monks used so-called cups of tea to measure short periods of time, the time needed to drink a cup of hot tea without burning oneself and without hurrying, about 5 to 7 minutes. For longer periods, the concept of butter melting time was used. About 3 hours needed to prepare traditional Tibetan butter tea from yak milk. These everyday timers perfectly corresponded to the measured way of life in mountain monasteries. When we look back at these amazing traditions, it becomes clear how inventive humanity was in its pursuit to organize and measure time. From observing stars to aromatic sticks, from flower clocks to drum beats, each culture found its unique ways to orient in time. And what's particularly striking, many of these methods were no less accurate than modern digital gadgets. They just integrated differently into people's lives, making time not abstract numbers on a screen, but a living, tangible part of nature and culture. Time was measured not in seconds and minutes, but in natural cycles, processes, and rhythms. And perhaps in this was a deep understanding of the essence of time, not as an abstract linear scale, but as an integral part of life and being. Some psychologists say that the modern perception of time as a constantly escaping resource that needs to be economized, spent, and not lost makes us constantly tense and anxious. Unlike our ancestors, who lived in harmony with natural cycles, we have become slaves to clocks and calendars. Maybe we should sometimes return to a more natural perception of time? After all, when we stop constantly looking at the clock and simply immerse ourselves in the process, time takes on a completely different quality. It seems to stretch, becoming more filled and deep. And now a question for you. If you found yourself without a watch and phone, which of these 7 ways of determining time would you try to master first? Or maybe you have your own method when you roughly understand the time without looking at a clock? Perhaps you've noticed that your body itself knows when it's time to wake up, or that you accurately feel when about an hour has passed. Share in the comments your thoughts and stories about how you orient in time when familiar devices are unavailable. If the video was interesting and informative for you, don't forget to like and share it with friends. Your support helps us create more content about the amazing traditions and forgotten knowledge of our ancestors. And next time, we'll tell you about strange navigation methods that were used before the invention of the compass and GPS. How did people find their way home when they had neither a map nor a navigator? You'll learn about this in our next episode. Remember, time is measured not only by clocks, but also by the moments we live through. Take care of your time and fill it with meaning. Until we meet again.